What if the story didn't end with disappearance? What if the mystery of Tartaria is not about what was lost, but about what remains, hidden in plain sight? Because in the previous exploration, we looked at the idea that a powerful civilization may have existed, far more advanced, far more organized than we are told. A civilization often referred to as Tartaria. But what if that was only the surface? Because when we look deeper, we begin to notice something strange, not just in ancient maps, not just in forgotten texts, but in the world around us, right now. Because there are structures across different continents that seem to follow patterns, designs that repeat, architectural styles that appear in places that were never directly connected, massive buildings, domes, columns, intricate details, all sharing a certain aesthetic, a certain precision, a certain presence, as if they were built using the same knowledge, the same ideas, the same system. And yet, official history tells us these structures were built independently, at different times, by different cultures, without direct connection. And maybe that is true. But the similarities raise questions, because coincidence has limits, and when patterns repeat across distance and time, it suggests something else, a shared influence, a shared knowledge, or something that came before, something that spread and then disappeared. Because in many cases, these buildings are not just old, they appear repurposed, modified, as if what we see today is not the original form, but a version, adapted, changed to fit a different time. And if that is true, then it raises a powerful idea. What if parts of this civilization were not destroyed, but reused, integrated into newer societies, becoming part of history without being recognized? And if something is reused, then its origin can easily be forgotten or reinterpreted over time until the original story is no longer visible. Only fragments remain, fragments that don't quite fit, fragments that feel out of place, because sometimes the most important clues are not hidden, they are overlooked, because they are too familiar, too present, too normal to be questioned. And maybe that is exactly what happened here. Because if a civilization like Tartaria existed, and if it disappeared, then something must have remained, something physical, something real, something that could not simply vanish. And that something may still be around us, in forms we don't recognize, in structures we pass by, in details we ignore. Because once something becomes part of everyday life, it stops being questioned. It becomes accepted, even if its origins are unclear. And maybe that is the key to this mystery. Not what was erased, but what was left behind.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.
And when we begin to look closer at the buildings themselves, something even more unusual appears. Because in many cities around the world, there are structures whose origins are not entirely clear. Buildings that seem older, more complex, more detailed than the history assigned to them. Often referred to as orphan buildings, structures without a fully documented origin, or with histories that feel incomplete. Because while many buildings have clear timelines, clear records, clear purposes, others seem to appear already finished, already standing, already part of the landscape, as if they were inherited, rather than built. And when we examine these structures, we notice something consistent. They are not simple. They are not basic. They are highly detailed, highly symmetrical, often built with materials and techniques that would require significant resources, significant planning, significant knowledge. And yet, in many cases, the societies that supposedly built them were still developing, still expanding, still establishing themselves, which raises a difficult question. How do such advanced structures appear before the systems needed to create them are fully in place? Because construction of that scale requires more than labor. It requires coordination, engineering, logistics, time. And if those elements are not fully visible, then something is missing, something not recorded, something not explained. And then there is another detail, one that appears again and again across different locations: buried levels, entire sections of buildings hidden beneath ground, windows that lead nowhere, doors that open into earth, floors that seem lower than they should be, as if the ground itself has risen or the buildings have sunk over time. And while there are explanations, natural accumulation, urban development, changes in landscape, the scale of it, in some places, feels difficult to ignore, because it is not just one building, not just one city, but many, across different regions, showing similar patterns. And that repetition raises a possibility. What if parts of these structures were once fully visible, fully functional, at a different time, before something changed, before something covered them, before something altered the landscape? And if that is true, then what we see today is not the complete structure, but only the upper portion, the part that remains above, while the rest stays hidden below. And that idea changes the perspective entirely, because it suggests that what we consider history may only represent a surface layer, a visible layer, while something older, something deeper, exists beneath it, not destroyed, not erased completely, but buried. And if something is buried, then it can be forgotten, not because it is gone, but because it is no longer seen. And over time, what is no longer seen becomes unknown. And what is unknown can be reinterpreted, rewritten, or simply ignored, until only fragments remain. Fragments that don't quite fit, fragments that raise questions, but never fully connect. Because without the full picture, the story changes. And maybe that is exactly what happened.
And if the structures themselves raise questions, then what we see in old photographs raises even more, because there are moments in relatively recent history where entire cities appear, fully built, highly detailed, massive in scale, only to disappear in a very short time. Events often referred to as World's Fairs, large exhibitions held in different parts of the world, cities constructed for display, for celebration, for showcasing progress. But when we look at the images, something feels unusual, because these are not simple constructions, they are enormous, covered with intricate detail, columns, domes, statues, perfect symmetry. Architecture that would normally take years, even decades to complete. And yet, We are told many of these structures were built in a very short time, sometimes just a few years. And then, after the event, they were removed, destroyed, or simply vanished, as if they were never meant to remain. And that idea raises a powerful question. Why build something so detailed, so complex, so massive, only to remove it shortly after? Because effort of that scale is not insignificant. It requires planning, resources, time, and intention. And when something like that is created, it usually has a purpose beyond temporary display. Unless it wasn't truly temporary. Unless what we are seeing was not entirely new, but something that already existed. Something that was being used, repurposed, presented in a different context, and then removed again once that purpose was complete. Because when we look closely at some of these images, the level of detail feels consistent with the structures we discussed earlier. The same style, the same patterns, the same sense of scale, as if they are connected, not directly, but through something shared. A shared knowledge, a shared design language, or something inherited from an earlier time. And if that is true, then these events, they not just be exhibitions, they may be moments where something older briefly became visible again, before disappearing once more. And if something appears and then disappears without a clear explanation, it leaves behind a question, a gap, something that doesn't fully connect. Because the more we look, the more we notice that these patterns repeat. Structures with unclear origins, buried sections of buildings, cities that appear and vanish, details that feel too consistent across different times, across different places. And when patterns repeat like this, it suggests something deeper, something underlying, something that is not immediately visible, but present. Because coincidence has limits, and when those limits are crossed, we are left with something else, a possibility that what we are seeing is only part of a larger story, one that has not been fully told.
And if these structures were not random, if they share patterns, if they appear across different places, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What were they for? Because architecture, at that scale, with that level of precision, is rarely just decorative. It serves a purpose, a function, something beyond appearance. And when we look closely at certain elements, something begins to stand out. Repetition. Not just in design, but in specific features. Domes, spires, metallic structures at the highest points, intricate frameworks that seem too consistent to be purely aesthetic. Because when something repeats like that across different regions, across different buildings, it suggests intention, a shared idea, a function. And that is where a controversial theory begins. The idea that these structures were not just buildings, but part of a system designed to interact with energy. Now, there is no confirmed evidence, no definitive proof, but the idea continues to appear, because certain elements raise questions. Metal placed at high points, positioning that aligns with natural forces, designs that could allow movement of something invisible, something we cannot easily see. Because energy is not always visible, but it is always present. In the air, in the ground, in the environment around us. And throughout history, humans have learned to harness different forms of it: fire, water, electricity. And if knowledge evolves, then it is possible that earlier systems worked with energy in ways we do not yet understand or have forgotten. And if that idea feels distant, then consider this. Many discoveries we once thought impossible eventually became understood. eventually became normal, because understanding changes over time, and what seems unrealistic today may not always remain that way. And maybe that is what makes this idea so persistent, because even without proof, it connects patterns, it offers a possibility, it gives meaning to the similarities we see. And if these structures were part of something functional, then their disappearance becomes even more interesting, because systems do not simply vanish unless something replaces them, or something changes. And if something changed, then what we see now may not be the original world, but a version that came after, a version that inherited what remained without fully understanding it. And if that is true, then parts of that system may still exist, inactive, unused, or simply misunderstood. And maybe that is why the patterns remain, why the structures still stand, why the details feel just slightly out of place, because they belong to something older, something different, something we are only beginning to question.
The reset theory. And if all of this is connected, if the structures, the patterns, the similarities point to something larger, then one question becomes impossible to ignore. What happened to it? Because if a system existed, if a civilization reached a certain level, if knowledge was widespread, then it should have continued. It should have evolved. It should have left a clear, continuous record. But instead, we see something else. Gaps, discontinuities, moments where progress seems to stop or even reverse, as if something interrupted the flow. And that idea leads to one of the most discussed possibilities. Not a slow decline, but a sudden shift, a reset. Not necessarily an event we fully understand, but a transition from one state to another. Because when we look at history, there are moments where entire regions change rapidly, unexpectedly. Cities abandoned, technologies forgotten, knowledge lost. And while there are explanations, wars, natural disasters, economic collapse, some patterns feel larger than a single cause, because the changes appear across different regions within similar time frames. And that raises a possibility that something more widespread occurred, something that affected not just one place, but many. And if that is true, then the idea of a reset becomes more than just speculation. It becomes a way to connect the gaps, to explain why so many advanced-looking structures seem out of place, why knowledge appears and then disappears, why patterns repeat but never fully continue. Because in a reset, the system does not disappear completely. It changes. It restarts with fragments of what came before, fragments that survive, but without full context, without full understanding. And over time, those fragments become mysteries. Because without the full system, they don't make sense. They feel incomplete, out of place, just like the structures, just like the buried levels, just like the cities that appear and vanish. And maybe that is what we are seeing. Not a lost civilization, but the remains of a previous phase, a previous version of the world as we know it. And if that is true, then what we call history may only represent the current cycle, the latest version, built on top of something older, something partially forgotten, but not entirely gone. And if something is not entirely gone, then traces remain, clues, patterns, pieces that don't quite fit, but point towards something bigger, something that once existed and then changed.
the reset possibility. And if all of this is true, if there were structures, if there were patterns, if there was a system, then one question becomes impossible to avoid. What happened to it? Because civilizations do not simply vanish, not completely, not without leaving behind a clear trace, a clear explanation. And yet, in this case, the explanation feels incomplete. Because instead of a single event, a single collapse, a single reason, we find something else. Fragments, gaps, inconsistencies, stories that don't fully align. And when history becomes fragmented, it opens the door to possibility. Because one of the most discussed ideas is not destruction, but reset. Not a sudden end, but a transition, a shift from one phase to another. Because throughout history, there have been moments where change happens rapidly, where systems collapse, where new structures appear, where populations shift, where records become unclear. And these moments are often explained through natural causes, war, disaster, disease, and many times those explanations are valid. But sometimes they don't explain everything, because they account for the event, but not always the patterns that follow. And in this case, the patterns raise questions, because if a large system existed, and if it ended, then what replaced it should look entirely different. But instead, we see something unusual. Continuity. Structures still standing, designs still present, elements still visible, as if something was not destroyed, but inherited, taken over, adapted into a new system. And if something is inherited, then its origin can easily be lost, rewritten, or misunderstood over time, until what once existed is no longer recognized. Only fragments remain, fragments that seem disconnected until we begin to look at them together. And when we do, a different picture begins to form, not one of complete disappearance, but of transformation. Because a reset does not erase everything. It changes the structure. It reorganizes the system. It creates a new layer on top of what already exists. And if that is what happened, then the world we see today may not be entirely new. It may be built on something older, something that came before, something that was never fully understood after it changed. And that idea explains something important: why the patterns remain, why the structures still stand, why the details feel familiar yet unexplained. Because they are not from our beginning, they are from something earlier, something that became part of the foundation of everything that followed.
What if it was never fully gone? And maybe that is the part that changes everything. Because if it was a reset, if it was a transition, if something was inherited, then the story does not end. It continues in ways we don't immediately see. Because if something is not completely destroyed, if it is not fully erased, then it remains hidden, integrated, part of the world that comes after. And maybe that is why this mystery feels different. Because it does not feel distant. It does not feel like something that existed and is now gone. It feels closer, as if it is still here, in fragments, in patterns, in details we pass every day, without noticing. Because when something becomes part of normal life, it stops being questioned. It becomes background, invisible, even if it doesn't fully make sense. And maybe that is exactly what happened. Because if a system existed and then changed, then the new system would not necessarily remove everything. It would adapt, reuse, repurpose what was already there. And over time, the original meaning would fade, replaced by new explanations, new stories, new interpretations, until the connection is lost, and all that remains are pieces. Pieces that don't fully fit, pieces that feel just slightly out of place. And when we notice those pieces, when we begin to question them, something shifts, because suddenly, what once seemed normal becomes mysterious, and what once felt understood becomes uncertain. And that uncertainty is where the story begins again. Because every time a question is asked, every time a pattern is noticed, every time something doesn't quite make sense, the possibility returns. The possibility that something existed, something larger, something more organized, something more advanced than we have been told. And if that possibility exists, then it means something else. That the story is not finished, that it is still unfolding, still being discovered, still being questioned. Because the truth, if there is one, is not always obvious. It is not always clear. Sometimes it exists in fragments, in patterns, in moments where something feels just slightly different, just slightly out of place. And maybe that is where the real story is. Not in what is confirmed, not in what is written, but in what is noticed, what is questioned, what is still being explored.
And maybe that is where the mystery truly lives. Not in what we can prove, not in what is officially recorded, but in the space between what we see and what we don't fully understand. Because everything we've explored, the structures, the patterns, the buried levels, the cities that appeared and vanished, the similarities that repeat across continents, they all point to something. Not a clear answer, but a direction, a possibility, that something existed, something larger, something more connected than we currently understand. And if that possibility is real, then it changes the way we look at everything, because history would no longer be a straight line. It would be layers, built on top of each other, each one covering the last, each one reshaping the story, until the original picture is no longer visible. Only fragments remain, fragments that feel familiar, yet unexplained. And maybe that is why this mystery continues, because it is not fully hidden, but not fully revealed either. It exists in between, waiting for someone to notice, for someone to connect the patterns, for someone to ask the right question. Final scene. And after everything, after all the ideas, all the patterns, all the possibilities, one question remains, not loud, not obvious, but quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. What if the story we know is only part of the truth? Because if something existed before, if something left behind structures, designs, systems, then it didn't disappear completely. It became something else, something hidden, something integrated into the world we see today. Because the past does not always vanish. Sometimes it stays, in forms we don't recognize, in details we overlook, in patterns we don't question. And over time, those details become normal, accepted, even if they don't fully make sense. And maybe that is the most important part of this mystery. Not what was lost, but what remains. Because what remains can be rediscovered, re-examined, re-understood in a completely different way. And maybe that is where the story truly begins. Not in the past, but in the present. In the moment we start to question, the moment we start to notice, the moment something feels just slightly out of place.
because that feeling is not random. It is the beginning of awareness, the beginning of curiosity, the beginning of something deeper. And every discovery, every question, every idea brings us closer, not necessarily to answers, but to understanding. And maybe understanding does not mean having all the answers. Maybe it means seeing the world differently, seeing beyond what is obvious, seeing patterns where none were noticed before. Because once you begin to see those patterns, you cannot unsee them. And once you begin to question, the story changes, not completely, but enough to realize that there may be more, much more, hidden beneath the surface. And as everything fades, as the images disappear, as the story comes to an end, that one idea remains, simple but powerful. What if some of the most important parts of history were never truly lost, only forgotten, only hidden, only waiting to be discovered again?